Hey everybody, I'm JJ Johnson. You're watching Reality Survival, and so today we're going to talk about I don't know how many ways it is. I didn't number them. A bunch of different ways that your mind controls you. I don't know what the title of this video is going to be at this point. Something about mind control or something like that, probably. But the idea is, what I want to talk about is how bias affects your ability to process information and evaluate different sources of media and those kinds of things. So let's get into that here shortly. There's lots of different biases. The two types of bias that we seem to talk about most frequently, sorry, I'm just pushing my mic back, that we talk about most frequently in the prepper community are normalcy bias, and that is a kind of bias that your mind tends to think things are going to stay the same way they are, and they're not going to change in drastic ways, right? And that helps. That's actually a great form of bias that helps us all operate from a position where we're not always in a state of panic or fear, right? And then, what was the other kind of bias? Confirmation bias. We hear a lot about that too in the prepper community, because it's a kind of bias where if you think something ahead of time, then you read something and you're like, aha, I knew that was right. You instantly assign that thing that you're reading more credibility. So, okay, so the reason that we're talking about this before I get into this list in total is because I think that it's really important that we all understand the biases that run within our heads so that we can evaluate information objectively and try to be skeptical of, all different kinds of news sources. And I mean that from both the left and the right. There's awful information out there on both sides. So you really, really have to be careful about what you choose to put stock into. And it's not an easy world to navigate all the stuff that is going on in the world today with regard to media and information and all that kind of stuff. So that's why we're talking about these kinds of things, because if you understand the different biases that are in your head that help to form and shape your opinions and your views, then maybe you can fight back against some of these biases to stay a little bit more objective. At least that's my hope anyway. So number one is, and the video or the podcast that inspired this was a Jocko Willink podcast where he was talking about some of these. I'll see if I can leave a link to that podcast. If you're not subscribed to his podcast, you should be. It's a great podcast. And I'll also put the link from the articles of where I got this information as well. So the first one is reactive devaluation bias. So that is when you see information that comes from the adversary. So what that means is that you see a typical left-leaning New York Times article, and if you're on the right wing, you will automatically dismiss the validity of that article just because it comes from the New York Times. At full stop, kind of, nothing that they put out is correct. And that's not true. They actually do a lot of investigative journalism still, even to this day, where they sometimes get it right. They did some publications on the false positives on COVID tests, and PCR testing and stuff like that. They've done lots of investigative journalism pieces that expose things, and then coincidentally they just kind of get buried and tucked away. But the point is that you shouldn't necessarily discount something just because of where it comes from on that factor alone. But that would be the reactive devaluation bias. All right, the next one is anchoring bias. So this one has to do with what you hear first gives it more primacy, gives it more credibility. So if you hear something, I don't know what the example would be. I don't know. You pick your example. It doesn't matter. But whatever you hear first, you've assigned credibility to that in your head, when you have a hard time dissuading yourself of other alternatives that come subsequent to that. All right, so just because you hear something first doesn't necessarily mean that it is more correct. All right, the other one is availability bias. Now this one is, we already talked about confirmation bias. It's what you thought of on your own, and when you hear something that matches with it, then you assign it more credibility. So the next one after that is availability bias, and this happens a lot in the prepper community because a lot of times preppers, kind of tend to circulate certain information pools, and that information might get circulated, throughout that particular community a lot, and so you hear it from multiple different sources, and you think, oh, well, it must be real because I'm hearing it from all these different sources, and that also applies to sort of the mainstream media. You've all seen those videos where the talking points come out from multiple different channels, and they're all saying the same thing over and over and over and over on multiple different channels, and that's availability bias. You're hearing it from all these people. Well, it's got to be true, not necessarily. So try to stay objective. Okay, the next one is blind spot bias, and so this is you think that you're better at staying unbiased than everybody else. Right? And because I'm putting this video out, it might be easy to say that I have blind spot bias, right? I'm not saying that I'm not susceptible to all these just the same as everybody else. I'm just saying let's just try to be aware of them. So if you're a person who traditionally thinks that you are unbiased across the board, you might be suffering from blind spot bias. Maybe you're being more influenced than you think. Just something to think about. Okay, the next one is conformity bias, and that is essentially peer pressure. I think a lot of people have seen this in friends and family and all that kind of stuff with regard to masks and vaccinations and all those different kinds of things. They just go along with the herd. Well, that's what everybody's saying, so that's what they're doing, and that isn't always necessarily a good thing. So conformity bias is that one. The next one, a little different name. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. I think of it more as like simplicity bias. This particular bias refers to how people perceive a concept or event to be simplistic just because their knowledge about it may be simple or lacking. The less you know about something, the less complicated it may appear. However, this form of bias limits curiosity. People don't feel the need to further explore a concept because it seems simplistic to them. This bias can also lead people to think they are smarter than they actually are because they have reduced a simple complex idea to a simplistic understanding. And to me, the one that jumps out is chemtrails. People think they're like, oh, geoengineering is happening and chemtrails are happening all over the place, and they don't know anything about the subject of what it would take to do some massive project like that, and so they reduce it to this simple thing, and they think that's just it. It happens, and there's no confusing it. And because I saw a couple of pieces of information that confirmed my bias, they believe it. And I think this one's a big one. The Dunning-Kruger effect, or simplicity bias. You think something is just a simple little thing, and so you don't really dig into it anymore to find out how complex that problem really is to understand it more fully, and you just explain it away like it's nothing. So that's a good one, I thought. So the next one is in-group bias. This type of bias refers to how people are more likely to support or believe someone within their own social group than an outsider. This bias tends to remove objectivity from any sort of selection or hiring process, as individuals tend to favor those who they personally know and want to help. So left versus right? Prepper versus non-prepper. I don't know what other ways you want to break it down. Communist versus capitalism, I mean, whatever. But it's pretty easy to see how it's easier to assign correctness to something or someone that's within your own group that believes the same as you do. So let's try to avoid that one and try to be as objective as we can. All right, so the next one is decline bias. So decline bias, the decline bias refers to the tendency to compare the past to the present, leading to the decision that things are worse or becoming worse in comparison to the past simply because change is occurring. And when I hear this one, this is what I think of: the old crotchety guys in every generation that says, oh, the good old days. The good old days, they were so much better back in the good old days. And when in reality, that's not true at all. We live in the best time in history right now, 100%. There's no question about it. We definitely live in the best time in history, bar none, right? Every measurable level, there is just, to me, there's no way to even argue this fact, all right? But we tend to think that things are falling apart. This is a super, super big one in the prepper community, and I'm just as guilty of it as everybody else, because I just did a video talking about the top 10 things to expect in 2022, and like 9 of those 10 were not great, So we all have this tendency, especially in the prepper community, to think that things are going to fall off a cliff. The reality is that, statistically speaking, the chances are we're probably going to be okay. We may experience a dip, but society as a general rule for the last 5,000 years or so has tended to continue to move upward, and we probably will still do that on the long trends. There's dips along the road all the way, but eventually we get through things. So that's probably the most likely situation. But yeah, there's always those old guys, they're just talking about how bad it's getting and all that kind of stuff, and lots of people talk about how they think Jesus is going to return and all this kind of stuff, and that's fine. You believe what you want to believe. I'm not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with it. I think the Bible says that no man will know the time and the coming of the place of the Lord, and I just agree with that. I'm like, I don't know when he's going to come back, So anyway, that's that. We'll move to the next one. This one is optimism or pessimism bias. This bias refers to how individuals are more likely to estimate a positive outcome if they're in a good mood, and a negative outcome if they're in a bad mood. Now, this is an interesting one because I think I've talked about it before, where Facebook has talked about the fact that they can control emotions in people based off of the content that they feed them. I don't know if you guys know this, but Facebook is constantly in a rotational cycle of conducting the large-scale tests on hundreds of thousands of people all the time to see if they can predict their outcomes and what they do, how they react, how they share, how they comment, all that kind of stuff. There's a whole lot of stuff happening on Facebook behind the scenes to be able to learn what and how people think and react, and how to control those emotions. So optimism and pessimism bias is interesting. It's basically saying that if you're in a good mood, you'll tend to react more positively. If you're in a bad mood, you'll tend to react more negatively. Now, if you're a person who's in the prepping lifestyle and all that kind of stuff, and you tend to always be in a bad mood, if you have a lot of depression and those kinds of things, that's going to cause you to continue to look at things more and more negatively, and that could potentially drive more and more behaviors in a bad way. So I would just suggest that if that is you objectively, if you can look and say that you're always in a bad mood and you don't ever have times of being in a good mood, maybe you should seek some counseling or something like that. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not a sign of weakness or anything like that. It's just saying that maybe I need to focus on my emotional health a little bit right now, because that's a huge portion of of anybody's health, and not just even in the prepping community, but you gotta have good mental health. And so if you're not balanced, if you don't have times that you're in good moods and bad moods, and somewhere in between, all over there, and those things kind of vary in a natural degree, and you're always stuck on one side, then and really, even if you're always in a good mood, that you might need some counseling there too. Maybe you need to wake up to reality. But but you get my point. If you're always really focused on negative stuff, it's going to snowball effect and cause you to look at things more and more pessimistically. And I think that the whole QAnon thing can be attributed there. That in my opinion, I've told you guys this in the past. I tend to think that is a foreign psychological operation that was conducted, or is being conducted on the American population, especially the right, to drive them to be more reactive and chaotic and all that kind of stuff. I really do, and that's unfortunate. But anyhow, the next one on the list here is, how many we got? We still got a few more. Holy cow! The next one is self-serving bias. Now, this is a self-serving bias is an assumption that good things happen to us when we've done all the right things, but bad things happen to us because of circumstances outside our control or things other people purport. This bias results in a tendency to blame outside circumstances for bad situations rather than taking personal responsibility. Now, when this particular bias brings up into my head, I've said for a long time that I think that on the right, we are responsible for where we are in this country. It's not the left's fault. I think those independents and the people on the right have been complacent, and they haven't stayed involved in citizen government. You haven't gotten in there and gone and worked on the city council and worked in the county commissioners board and the high school board or the school education boards and all that kind of stuff. We've let people who have really radical opinions, far on the left and progressive side, take those institutions over. And as a result of it, we've suffered the consequences over the last couple of years. You've seen how people have reacted. And I think that is self-serving bias kind of, highlighted in that. I don't know. All right. Next one is information bias. Information bias is a type of cognitive bias that refers to the idea that amassing more information will aid in better decision making, even if that extra information is irrelevant to the subject at hand. So, gathering a whole bunch of information from lots of different sources and coming up with something may not necessarily be the right answer if the answer that you're looking for is a very specific and narrowed topic, and something that has, something to do with whatever the topic is. You may need to focus in on it as opposed to taking such a wide variety of information in and then allowing that to influence your opinions. All right. So selection bias is the next one. Selection bias refers to the way individuals notice things more when something has happened to make us notice that particular thing more. Kind of like when you buy a new car, you see all those cars all the time. It just says that. Yeah, like when you buy a new car and suddenly notice more models of that car on the road. The car has simply become part of the individual's observations, so they tend to observe it more elsewhere, also known as observational selection bias. Now, if you spend a lot of time looking for ways that things can potentially become disastrous, like if you're a prepper, which most of the people who watch this channel are, and you are focused on regional and national types of disasters, then you will start to observe more and more data out there about those things. And that can make you think that those things are more likely to occur. That's not necessarily the case. They may objectively have, whatever statistical ratio of it happening, but you might think that that is higher than it really is if you're always looking at that kind of information, if that makes sense. You're programming your mind essentially to recognize those kinds of information, and then you assign it a higher level of credibility. That's kind of the way I read that one. Okay, so fundamental attribution error. This bias refers to an individual's tendency to attribute someone's particular behaviors to existing unfounded stereotypes while attributing their own similar behavior to external factors. Okay, so for instance, when someone on your team is late to an important meeting, you may assume that they are lazy or lacking motivation without considering internal and external factors like illness or traffic accident that led to the tardiness. However, when you're running late because of the flat tire, you expect others to attribute the error to the external flat tire rather than your personal behavior. Again, I think we can look at this and apply this to so many different things that goes on in our society right now. But I think that was pretty obvious, so we probably don't need to discuss that too much. Okay, hindsight. This is the last one here. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is also known as the knew-it-all-along effect. My wife is particularly good at this one. I give her a hard time sometimes about it. It's when people perceive events to be more predictable after they happen. With this bias, people overestimate their ability to predict an outcome beforehand, even though the information they had at the time would not have led them to the correct outcome. This type of bias happens often in sports and world affairs. Hindsight bias can lead to overconfidence in one's ability to predict future outcomes. And again, focusing in on kind of the prepper community and all that kind of thing, I'd say it's pretty easy to see how this could fit when you're processing information about different types of disasters and all that kind of stuff. Looking at different market crashes and, trying to time those cycles and that kind of thing, and, making it seem like, hey, we're overdue for X. We're overdue for a pandemic. We're overdue for this or that. And maybe that may be the case, but it might not be too, so you just got to kind of take it for what it's worth. So anyway, that has been just a whole bunch of different ways that your mind controls you and how you perceive information, how you process information, and how you take in information. And so I would just recommend to you to be aware of those biases. Try to do the best that you can to remain as objective as possible, and be selective about where you get your news and all that kind of stuff. And try to just learn. Just learn from the good and the bad, and all that kind of stuff. So don't rely too heavily on too few of things, but also don't get drowned and swamped in way too much information. So it's kind of a weird balance, but if you're aware of these biases, I think it'll help you make better decisions on the decisions that you make for you and your family, in how you're going to allocate resources as far as preparing for disasters and those different kinds of things. There's lots of disasters out there, lots of things that happen to bad people all the time, but we want to be responsible and want to do things in a financially responsible way, and you don't want to always be in that situation where you're like, oh, this is the big one, because chances are it's not going to be the big one. It rarely ever is. And so it doesn't mean it can't happen, but usually we recover, and usually the trend of society is to continue to move forward, and, with technological progression and all those kinds of things. So we just need to recognize that, because it's really easy to get lost in the idea that doom and gloom is coming, and there's going to be collapses, and there's going to be crashes, and there's and all that kind of stuff, and you think that that's going to be the end, and it's there's going to be this big SHTF kind of thing. We all in this community, we talk about those things a lot, mostly because they're a vehicle for being able to freely think and hypothesize and all that kind of stuff. But there's a good number of people who fully really think that we're on the edge of disaster. And while it could be true, it's probably not true. And we're probably going to get through all this. There's just going to be some changes that we all have to adjust to, and we'll either adjust or we won't. And even if there is civil unrest, and even if there is civil war, and even if there is, different kinds of upheavals, we'll get through those things. It's not to say that bad things can't happen, but the general tendency of society is to move forward, even if there are road bumps. So anyway, I hope this makes sense to you guys. I would love to hear about other types of bias. If I missed something, I know there are a lot more, then put those down in the comments below, and I'd love to read about those. So anyway, thanks for watching, and don't forget to live the 6 Ps. Proper prior preparation prevents poor performance. Stay safe, guys.